Hello, and welcome to this week's Ask an Atheist. My name is Liz Cavell. I'm Associate Counsel for the Freedom from Religion Foundation. Today, we are going to talk about some of the latest in anti-trans hysteria. There's some really interesting headlines from the past couple of weeks that we want to discuss that sort of illustrate some of the super religion-focused anti-trans bigotry that we're seeing infiltrating our laws and our public spaces. So we're going to have a conversation. And as always, if you have questions about the topic today, you can drop them in the comments below, or you can send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. I am joined today by attorney Kat Grant, who has a fellowship at FFRF through Equal Justice Works. Hi, Kat. Thank you for being here today.
Hello.
So we want to just jump into a headline from the past couple of weeks to get the conversation started. Kat, why don't you tell us what's going on in Texas?
Yeah, so last week, West Texas A&M University, their Pride student group was planning a drag show to fundraise for the Trevor Project, which, if you don't know what the Trevor Project is, it is a big, major national nonprofit focused on suicide and self-harm prevention for LGBTQ youth. I was having a discussion with a few people about the Trevor Project the other day, and I think for my generation of queer people specifically, we all either have used or know someone who has used and whose life has been saved by the Trevor Project. So it's really, really important. So this group, Spectrum, and several other groups on campus were planning a charity drag show. And the president of West Texas A&M swooped in and said, "Not on my watch."
And yep, look at that fun guy.
Yeah. He essentially said, you can see there that drag performances degrade women and that they're derisive, divisive, and demoralizing misogyny, which I love a triple alliteration, so I'll give him credit for that.
Mm-hmm. He worked hard on that statement. Listen, that public university's president, just to be clear, swooped in and canceled a student-initiated charity event.
Yes. He swooped in, as insofar as we can tell, did this completely unilaterally. And in his statement that he sent out to students, faculty, and staff, referenced his belief that drag is misogynistic and that as a Christian, he believes that all people are made in the, image of God and are deserving of dignity, and drag demeans women's dignity. And he compared it to blackface, which either means that he has no historical understanding of blackface, no historical understanding of drag, or most likely both.
Well, so I think so I'll do the charitable view. What he was trying to make an analogy to was like a student show that would involve blackface is to black people as drag is to women.
Yes,
right.
Like, that was his.
It's as
interpretation.
Right. It's exactly the same as and you probably know, looks like and definitely is a believable feminist hero.
Yes. Well, in his statement to students, he was like, my wife, my best friend of, several decades, is a woman. I'm not a woman, but she is. And I know that that's, bad and terrible. And so he went in on both this anti-free speech tirade and this weird religious tirade where he justified censoring student speech and expression through his religious views. So really, it's a 1-2 punch of First Amendment issues here.
Interesting. Okay. So what happened next? This was like a week or two ago that he decided to cancel the event. The event was supposed to happen next week? This week?
It was supposed to happen on the 31st.
Okay.
So right now where we're at with this is FIRE has filed suit with the student groups. They were asking for the show to be allowed to go ahead. Their initial motion was denied because it was a very particular type of motion that we don't need to get into the really fine minutia of, but they were asking for a very extraordinary type of relief that would not give the university an opportunity to respond so that they would have enough time to actually plan and execute this show. So now the earliest they are most likely to hear as to whether or not they will get an injunction that will allow them to do the show is tomorrow, the day
Interesting.
before the show. And now I've known plenty of drag performers in my life, and as someone who ran a college band sorority in undergrad, I can tell you that they will be able to be ready to go. I know no group of people who are able to put on a show faster, but it is frankly ridiculous that they have to sit and wait and be like, I know that they have decided the show will happen either on campus or off campus. They will have the show. But it's ridiculous that they have to sit and wait based on one university administrator's religious views.
Yeah. So I have a lot to say about this, but I just want to back up and point out FIRE is a nonprofit that works specifically on free speech issues, and they are the organization that is working with the students and defending them in court as they sue to try and get their free speech rights restored. Because, of course, West Texas A&M is a government entity. They are a public school. They're an arm of the state. And so this guy, president, is acting in his official capacity, doing things with his governmental power.
Yeah, and I think it's especially worth noting that in his statement, he said, you know, I'm not going to allow this, even though the law appears that I should be required to allow it. So he knows what his responsibilities are as a government agent and as a government actor here.
Right. He just doesn't care because he has power and he is going to use it.
Right.
So he is in the unique position of violating both clauses of the First Amendment in one fell swoop, because he is, again, taking a government action that is completely theocratic. He is enforcing his own religious viewpoint onto the student body in his action canceling this show, and in doing so is also violating their free speech rights because he is censoring their viewpoint.
Right.
So this is bad all around, and just kind of emblematic of this whole like anti-trans craze, right? And I was interested to see, or I was kind of waiting to see where all the like free speech on campus and academic freedom folks are on this battle.
Crickets.
Yeah.
Crickets as usual when it comes to the more left-leaning, non-conservative voices on campus. It's as soon as they're trying to censor something like a drag show, free speech on campus? What's that? We really don't know.
Right. So I want to take a minute, Kat, and especially while we're on the A&M thing, because I think it's a good illustration. We get some like good faith questions about why FFRF wades in or speaks out when these anti-trans government actions are happening, and how do we view it as part of our mission at FFRF to keep religion and government separate? And to some people, it's really obvious. And I think to some good faith people, it's not so obvious. And then to some bad faith people, I'm not talking to you because I don't care. But I think to the good faith questions, let's like talk about that, because one, this particular kerfuffle like illustrates some of those points. And also, while we have Kat here in the studio, they are literally here at FFRF through a fellowship at Equal Justice Works, which is a public service fellowship sponsor for a lot of recent law grads and law students that are trying to do interesting work in the public sector. Kat wrote their own fellowship proposal and was accepted by Equal Justice Works and funded here at FFRF, which is a really competitive process.
Yeah.
And the whole purpose of the fellowship has to do with the answer to this question, which is, what is the intersection between what's happening to the trans community in government, in our legislative houses, in the courts, and what we are trying to do here at FFRF and in keeping religion and government separate.
Yeah, so it's really interesting in that when I first wrote my fellowship proposal, you know, it's a little over a year and a half ago now that I actually wrote the proposal down. it looked very different than what I am currently doing, because while there have been a lot of anti-trans things ratcheting up over the past several years, it just really popped off this year.
Yeah.
But really, at the core of it, all of this is based in religion, because queer people, homosexuality, bisexuality, these terms that we use to define a very Western understanding of sexuality and gender, have existed forever. You can look at any point in history and find people that we would now define as trans. And when you look at what these bills and what these actions, banning drag shows, whatever you have, they are based in a very specific religious viewpoint, that same-sex marriage is false marriage, that trans people are an abomination to God. We see time and time again how one of the phrases I've come across a lot in doing this work over the past, 6 or so months is the idea that we need to value the law of God over the law of man. You see that, I've seen that phrase repeated over and over again by politicians, by pastors, by candidates for office. And so it's really all a part of this much broader Christian nationalist theocratic push that we've been seeing over the past couple of years. And so while sometimes it gets framed in ideas of, well, we just don't know what the science is when we're talking about puberty blockers, even though puberty blockers, the science has been fairly definitive for the past 30 years. Gender-affirming care, the science has been extremely solidified over the past decades. We're just asking questions, but those questions are based in a very religious understanding of what gender and sex and sexuality are. And I think even for people who are non-religious, and I think this is an uncomfortable truth that people sometimes need to stop, breathe, and grapple with, is that cultural impact of religion still informs a lot of our understanding of gender. And so I think that's really the approach we've been taking when we see these anti-trans things, is either there is a very explicit element, like in the West Texas A&M case or in some other cases that we're going to talk about here soon, or, you might not see it written into the law, but, I've spent the past 3 months, March is almost over, 3 months, just sitting and watching legislative hearings where, legislators in various states will stand up and say, I am doing this for God. I am doing this for Jesus. Right. And that's really important. And I'll talk about this a little bit later. But the text of law is not just what we look at when we're interpreting law. We also look at what was in the debates. We look at what is in the committee reports. That's how statutory interpretation works. So it's very scary to sit and see, all of this anti-trans stuff being directly related to religion. And that's really where the core of the intersection is that these beliefs are inherently religious.
Right. And we're not just weighing in to the social debate, although we all have social opinions. We are weighing in where government actors, including legislators, which you're talking about, this is what the legislators are saying in floor debate on these bills when they're introducing the bills, when governors are signing these bills at the signing ceremonies. These are the purposes behind legislative action that is coming out of the mouths of the elected officials that are turning these laws into reality. So this isn't about social debate and how comfortable we as a society are with understanding and including and, seeing trans people. This is about government action that is purely driven by religious ideology. When the evidence-based approach to lawmaking is telling us something else. And we see this in tons of areas of law, not just in the anti-trans movement. It's just, this is what the theocrats are obsessed with right now.
Yeah, I think it's very, very similar to the abortion issues that we've been seeing in reproductive rights. They use the exact same playbook for reproductive rights that they've been using to attack same-sex rights.
Right. And it's it's true and it's fair that reasonable people, including non-religious people, can have different views on these issues. But we, as secular, advocates, we want our laws to be based on reason, science, evidence, those types of best practices that are secular, not whoever happens to be in office, their religious views. So this isn't the only case of Christian hysteria over trans people making the headlines. We are going to talk about what headlines we saw out of Vermont these past couple of weeks and months. So Mid-Vermont Christian School is a high school in Vermont, obviously, and recently made headlines because they forfeited a basketball game that was part of a big state tournament because the team that they were playing against had a transgender student on the roster.
Right.
So that happened like a month ago, and as a result, that team, the Christian school team, was ousted from the league, I think, by the state body that governs.
Yeah, I believe it was like the conference body.
Exactly. So this is really interesting and is kind of creating a lot of controversy, but let's talk about what happened there, and also it's kind of a contrast in state action on the Vermont side.
Right. So with the Mid-Vermont Christian School, they are a private school, and they have rights as a private school and as a religious school. But they were playing in a state tournament, and essentially, the governing body said, okay, you can choose not to play against trans students, but our rules for this conference say that under certain conditions, trans students can play with the team of their assigned gender. Now, these conditions have existed for decades now.
Right.
Like, pretty much every state school athletic association has rules these days for when and where trans students can compete and under what gender designations. This is not a new thing, even though it seems to have just really hit like the national consciousness. The Mid-Vermont Christian School, their officials were saying that this is an issue of safety, that we shouldn't have our girls competing against biological men. And it's always very interesting to me that it's always protecting girls' sports. There are never concerns about boys' sports, and that they always refer to these teenagers, and often in a lot of cases children, as men and not as boys, at least.
Right.
Because there's a very specific image I think they have in mind of trans people who are competing in these athletic competitions. But they basically said, we're taking a stand against letting biological males compete against women. And the conference basically said, yeah, okay, you can do that, but you can't play in our conference then.
Right.
Yeah.
And I mean, that seems appropriate, right? That's like the appropriate boundary between state action and like private prerogative. This is a private Christian school, like they don't want to play against teams that have trans students on their roster. Great. This tournament is not the place for you. This is a state-run tournament, or a state-run like basketball league, and these are our rules. And we're not gonna like. What kills me, we were talking about this before we went on, is that like at the center of this controversy and all these headlines and all this chaos is literally one student on this opposing team that is quite aware that this is all about them.
Yeah.
And it's awful. This is like a kid in high school that's just like playing basketball on their team.
I remember being an out trans high schooler. It is not a fun time. And, I really respect that it seems like this girl has a lot of support from her teammates and from, her school that, a lot of kids probably wouldn't have gotten in the past and probably do not get in other parts of the country to be able to compete on a gendered sports team. But it's having to be a student advocate is exhausting. Having to be an advocate at all is exhausting. But when you're also just trying to be a kid and go to school, this kid just wants to play basketball.
Yeah.
There's nothing harmful about a kid just wanting to play basketball with her friends.
Right.
And, that's how it is for all of these sports cases, is that it's a handful of children in any given state. In some states, there aren't even any known cases of trans children playing. But when there are, these students are sitting there and being like, why is my state government or why is my state, athletic association, why are they targeting me? Like, I'm just a person, just minding my own business. They should be thinking about college. They should be thinking about jobs. They should be thinking about, oh gosh, is the cute person going to ask me to prom?
Right.
They should not be thinking about, is my governor going to call me an abomination to the Lord?
Right. And I'm going to be made an example of by all these bad actors, like, to make a point that isn't real, right? Like, there's not a real harm or concern, or there's not a thing happening that's really being guarded against or pushed back against, right? There are like a few, a minority, a handful, sometimes one or a couple in a state, student athletes that are impacted, but it's not like we have this widespread problem of like, this is some super complex way of like gaming the sports system to like.
There's this myth that underperforming male athletes are transitioning and becoming trans to dominate women's sports. That has never happened. And it creates this really awful situation for trans athletes where if you don't perform well, it's, oh, well, you're just an underperforming athlete who is trying to game the system. And if you do perform well, it's, oh, you're dominating and you shouldn't be in this league.
Right.
So you cannot win as a trans athlete in any sense of the word. And so it's incredibly difficult when we've had systems in place for this for a really long time to just now anytime a trans athlete does anything, they're in the news. And again, I just really need to emphasize this myth, and this is also used for bathrooms and this idea that trans women in particular are sexual predators, has been debunked over and over and over and over again by athletic associations, by domestic and sexual violence nonprofits. This is not real. This is manufactured hysteria in order to push trans people out of public life.
Right. Speaking of pushing trans people out of public life, Arkansas is also making some news in their legislature. And this goes to the legislators and the governors telling us exactly what the purpose behind their bills are. So what's going on in Arkansas?
Right. So in Arkansas, we just saw that the governor, Sarah Huckabee Sanders, has signed legislation prohibiting transgender people from using public school facilities that match their gender identity. And this was specifically crafted by the National Association of Christian Lawmakers. And so this bars trans students from using the appropriate locker rooms, bathrooms, those types of facilities in Arkansas public schools. And Sarah Huckabee Sanders and the National Association of Christian Lawmakers have made it very clear that their goal is to get this biblical worldview, a very specific, view of even just Christianity, to be the law of the land.
And this was a bill that was signed by the governor. So,
yes.
I mean, we're seeing these bills introduced all over the place and, progressing, sadly, in multiple states. But this is a bill that has become law. This is the law of the land in Arkansas right now.
Yes, and we will likely see legal challenges to this. We have seen these types of policies and laws and procedures be challenged time and time again. We are probably headed towards a pure circuit split, which means that the different circuits across the United States of federal judges have different opinions on this. But the law for a long time has said, no, trans students can in fact use the facilities of their, identified gender. We just saw, so for a long time, one of the key cases in that has been the Whitaker case, which was even pre-Bostock, which protects Title VII and employment protections, which is now what we're kind of debating now. But before that, we had Whitaker in the Seventh Circuit. We had the Gavin Grimm case, which is very famous. And we are waiting right now to hear another Seventh Circuit case that was just recently heard. It was the Martinsville and Vigo County school districts in my home state of Indiana. They had very weird policies about when trans students could use the bathroom, basically saying if they enrolled with a birth certificate that said a certain gender, that is what they had to use, but they could not update their birth certificates, which was wild. And I listened to those oral arguments, and even Judge Easterbrook, who's a pretty conservative guy, was like, well, now that doesn't make any sense. So we will likely hear again from the Seventh Circuit on that topic. I have a sinking feeling, unfortunately, and it sucks that it's a sinking feeling, that this will probably be in, if not the next Supreme Court term, the one immediately following.
Yeah. Which is a shame, because this actually, again, almost like the sports issue, has not been controversial, even though it's been present in our like federal jurisprudence for decades.
Yeah, like it's been in the discourse, and this is something I always, when I'm talking to people about this topic, I always emphasize, I promise you, whoever you are out in the world, you'll have been in the bathroom with a trans person. You don't know this because everyone is in the bathroom to relieve themselves. They are not there to say, hello, I am trans. They're just there to pee. We're also seeing, speaking of Arkansas, there's another bathroom bill that they're currently considering. Now, it was defanged a little bit yesterday during hearings, but they are moving forward with a bill that would make it a sex crime for a trans person to be in a bathroom if there is a minor present. Now, they have defanged this a little bit by saying it's only a sex crime. An amendment was added that was like, it's a sex crime if a trans person is there while a minor is present for sexual purposes. But it's still awful that this bill has moved forward.
Right. Like, so many thoughts. But we could have a whole, like, show on how exactly these bills are, when they're conceptualized as laws, how do you envision enforcing them?
Yeah. And what it comes down to is that enforcing them will require genital checks. And historically, that's how things like anti-cross-dressing laws were enforced, was that police officers would ask to see the genitals of the people they were arresting. And I have a whole blog planned on this in the future. You know, I have a couple of blogs coming out soon, but one in the near future is going to be about that, is that it is going to involve, you know, for adults, genital checks, but also for children. And that's what we're seeing with these sports bans as well, is that are we going to be asking referees to look at children's genitals? If you're concerned about sexual assault and you're concerned about sexual abuse, that's what you need to be worried about, not one trans kid who is probably changing in a stall.
Right.
Not even in the locker room itself, but like in a stall in the locker room.
Right.
That's how these things are going to be enforced.
And again, like, this is not like an organic growth out of like a problem that needs a solution.
Right.
This is a means of targeting a group of people, right? That is why, I mean, this is like the broader anti-democratic part of this, which is like, this is just like pure fascism, when it's just like, there's a group of people that we're gonna target. We don't have any like real problems being caused by this like demographic.
It is these very, and it's all the usual suspects. I didn't send a link so we could have a graphic for it, but recently, and if you've been watching the headlines, you've probably seen it, there was a huge report put out by Mother Jones that other news outlets have picked up on, where a bunch of emails were leaked, and it was the usual suspects of Alliance Defending Freedom, First Liberty. They have, for several years now, been working to dismantle trans rights in the United States. Right. They are the ones writing this model legislation.
Right. And back to like why FFRF opposes this legal movement, a big part of it is, look who's behind it. It's our same, you know, adversaries, the same groups, and the ones that you named are these extremist Christian conservative legal outfits that are hugely funded and, you know, in notoriously shadowy ways. And And they have, I mean, for those of us who have been doing this work for like a decade, they have been our adversaries every step of the way. And it started as a dismantling of state-church separation in the traditional sense, right? Like, you know, Christianity, it doesn't matter if like governments endorse Christianity, and our founders don't even care about that. And crosses across the land are fine on public property. And, you know, everyone can just look away. And it's setting up this, you know, Christian, like theocratic, like secular, you know, there's this idea that like the civic body is Christian, and that that's just part of what it means to be America.
Yeah.
And that is the groundwork for what we're seeing now. They've done that. They've captured the courts by like perverting all the democratic institutions and put their extreme judges on federal courts, and most notably the Supreme Court. And they've already done all that damage to state-church separation as we've been fighting it on those fronts for the past couple of decades. Now they can proceed to like truly just target these groups that go against their Christian worldview and whose acceptance by American society threatens this Christian nationalist, you know, civic religious idea that they all hold and that the rest of us don't. And it's all the anti-LGBTQ. They were the same groups behind all of the marriage equality, you know, anti-marriage equality efforts. You know, they kind of lost that in the courts and have just moved on to, okay, fine, we're just going to make sure that that equality is meaningless because we're going to go after all of the public accommodations and anti-discrimination laws, and we're going to go after trans people because, you know, they're still really vulnerable and misunderstood.
And I think it's really important to mark that they are going after trans people because we are such a small community. There are just not a lot of us, and that's fine. That doesn't mean we're not illegitimate. If you know someone who is left-handed or you know someone who has red hair, the percentages are about the same. You know, my parents were kind of 2 for 2. They have a left-handed, red-headed child, and they have a trans child. Like, they really managed it on that front. You know, good for them.
Right. It's a small group, which makes it like vulnerable just by numbers. You know, minority vulnerable, but also like a deeply a traditionally hidden community, a misunderstood community, and that makes them uniquely vulnerable to exactly what's being, you know, perpetrated on them by these groups.
And I think it's also important to mention that these groups are so extreme compared to the data we now have on anti-discrimination protections and support for same-sex marriage. You know, there was just that new PRRI, which is incredibly difficult to enunciate, study that just came out a couple of days ago that, you know, you're seeing their support for same-sex marriage by state is incredibly high. And I think any of us that have been watching those numbers, you know, I remember seeing a map very similar to that when I was in like middle school writing my first, you know, social studies paper about why we should have same-sex marriage, and those numbers were a lot lower.
Right, and you see on that map, right, the key literally starts at like 50% basically, right? 49% and up to 82 or 3. I'm blind, so I can't see that. But the scale of support that we're talking about is 50% and up. I mean,
and it's even higher for anti-discrimination protections, even amongst religious people.
Right.
You know, it's high majorities of religious folks across the country are in favor of anti-discrimination protections, but you wouldn't know that based on the discourse, based on who is funding these lawsuits, based on who is funding the politicians that are in charge of appointing judges. You know, all of these very, very extremist, predominantly Christian groups are running the discourse in a direction that is contrary completely to democracy.
Right, exactly. And that's what's happening in these other issue areas that are ancillary to like strict state-church separation, establishment clause, you know, efforts. But that are completely driven by like theocratic forces, right? These are conservative Christian outfits and organizations that are trying to inject their theology into the law of the land, whether it concerns abortion, whether it concerns LGBTQ rights. And they're doing that. Like, that's all good and well if you do it by good old democracy and everyone agrees with you. Oh, it's not all good and well, which is why we have bills of rights.
Yeah.
Right? Like, protecting minority rights is important, like, no matter what the majority wants. But the majority doesn't even want these things. This is not a majoritarian view. Most Americans agree that government should stay out of the business of what we all get up to with regards to sex, gender, you know, how we navigate those issues with our own kids, within our own families, reproductive health, healthcare in general. Like, most Americans are in agreement that that's not the purview of elected officials.
Right. It has always been, you know, my right to swing my fist ends at your nose. Right. And that's generally a fairly solid way to operate.
Right. So again, like, that's the other part of this. There's a big anti-democratic component to what's being done by these actual religious actors, right? These are theocratic efforts. And the whole point is to legislate one group's narrow religious views, you know, onto all of us. The laws apply to all of us, whether we subscribe to that belief system or not. And that is what we are here to push back against, whatever area that pops up in. So we're going to see if there's any questions, audience questions, so that we can have some discussion if there's any engagement. And I'm going to do technology.
Got the iPad of destiny.
Mm-hmm. Every time I refresh things. Okay, here we go. Here's a question from Jason D. This is about West Texas. Could the president of West Texas A&M be removed from his position for his unconstitutional decision? A girl can dream.
Yeah, like, I would think so. I'm not an expert in, like, university administration and what those procedures would look like. I would think so. I think that's something that would likely go to the board of trustees and, like, the vice provosts.
I mean, we know.
Determine.
I mean, as has been widely reported and, like, basically admitted by him, he's violating university policy.
Yes, and that was the other thing that I did fail to mention, is that the university has a very specific policy about student speech and conduct, saying that expressive speech is protected regardless of ideology, religious belief, political belief, etc.
So setting aside, like, his like, the constitutionality of his conduct and the fact that as a government actor, he is censoring speech unlawfully, he's just, like, violating the rules of his employer, right? Like, he had the university has policies that directly speak to how the school, the university, through him, should treat student speech. He's violating those policies. So one would think that he could lose his job.
I would think that is a possibility. Semicolon, however, comma. It is West Texas A&M.
Right. He has the support of the. I mean, what's weird is there's I don't know if it's like legislation or just executive action in Texas on point, you know, directed at universities that are usually doing the opposite thing, which is bringing hate speech to campus, that, you know, hate group speakers to universities. And when the students rightfully, as is their right, protest against that, there's this, you know, conservative backlash saying, like, free speech on our campuses.
All whiny snowflakes,
academic freedom. And so as a response to some of that controversy, you have, like, you know, Greg Abbott and other Texas officials putting forth either legislation or executive action that says universities, like, you have to, like, allow free speech and academic freedom. And so ironically, the president in this situation is going against that guidance or, you know, like, legal authority in doing this because he's doing exactly what the conservatives are always complaining about in colleges.
Think this is also why it is so important to continue making noise about this and really support the activists on the ground in Texas that are working on this, because it is very easy, and, not to plug a blog I have coming up, but I mentioned this in an upcoming blog about the good things that are happening for trans people, that it is very easy to give up on these very conservative states, and we cannot do that.
Right.
We need to be supporting the people on the ground there that are staying and fighting. Otherwise, theocracy is going to win. So keep it loud, keep it angry. That's the only way to, especially with university like boards of trustees, as someone who was involved in the IU grad students union, anyone who has been involved in a graduate student union at a college knows you have to keep it loud and keep it angry, or the board of trustees is going to do nothing. So really supporting these activists is one of the best things we can do as a national community to try and help push the fact that he needs most likely to be removed from office.
Yeah. And I mean, this is not the first time as a university administrator, this exact guy has done this exact type of thing, which is discriminate against LGBTQ students in a public university setting in violation of university policy.
Yes, he got in trouble at Southern Illinois University for opposing benefits for same-sex married couples. So that he has a history, y'all.
Yeah. It's one of those things where it's like, don't be a public school administrator. I don't sew, and so I'm not a seamstress.
Yeah.
It's just easy. Don't do the thing that you're not fit to do.
Yeah, I can't drive, so I don't drive Ubers.
Okay, here's a question that is just like so expansive, but I'm going to put it out there in case we have any final thoughts on it. Mary asks, is there a reason for the extreme increase in anti-trans legislation and transphobia in recent years? And we sort of touched on this, and the reason is fascism, but I mean... But it is interesting, and we alluded to this too. It's like, and we talked about this on my most recent podcast episode, We Dissent, wherever you get your podcasts. We talked about this exact issue and the fact that actually in the past few decades, the law has been pretty strong, and the case law has been pretty strong in protecting trans people from discrimination under the law and viewing both like sex stereotyping and just like trans discrimination as discrimination on the basis of sex.
Yes, and there's also, we don't have time to talk about it, but there's also a very interesting slope on the Americans with Disabilities Act as well, in some of the legislation there that I will just throw out there. So there are so many multiple avenues. There's the Establishment Clause issues, there's the sex discrimination, there is a potential ADA claim with this type of thing. And I think really to get to
true that this is a recent something has triggered what we're seeing.
And what I think it is that it is sort of the double-edged sword of visibility. Trans people have never been more accepted and more visible in the United States. And that's scary for some people. And that is scary especially for people whose worldview dictates that people who are assigned male at birth need to behave and act and dress a certain way, and women need to behave and act and dress a certain way. And the idea of gender expansiveness, gender diversity, gender nonconformance, this whole idea that you can celebrate gender expression, which what drag is, it's performed by cis and trans and all sorts of performers. It's a celebration of gender expression. These ideas really feel threatening to people who believe in these very strict gender roles. And so the idea that we are now starting to be accepted, and I think especially that they have realized that they have, at this point in time, lost the battle on same-sex marriage, however, comma, once they're done with us, they will go for same-sex marriage.
Yeah.
It's that, old poem, they started with the communists, and I didn't like the communists, so I didn't say anything, so then they went to the trade workers, and I wasn't a trade worker, etc. They are going for the most visible yet most vulnerable population.
Right.
And I think that's really one of the biggest things here. I think that's why this uptick is there, is just we got just a thread of acceptance that we've been fighting and fighting and fighting for the entire history of this country.
Yeah.
And that scares people, and when people are scared, they lean into hate and they start yelling.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. Okay, and here's one more good question to wrap up on, which is what things are FFRF doing to advocate for trans rights? What can I do?
Yeah, so that's my entire job pretty much. So I do a lot of various things. When we have things like West Texas A&M come up, that goes to me. You know, when that came down our email thread, it was pretty immediate. It was, okay, Kat, get a letter out, and we start talking about it and we start making noise. I feel like every time I'm on this show, I'm like, you got to make noise, you got to be loud. But that's the biggest part of it.
Right.
When we are starting to build capacity to take on more litigation-related things, and that's another part of what I do is, you know, I'm here until, I know what years are, 2024. And I'm working on building internal capacity. So as we have more of these censorship-related cases and cases where this intersection is really strong, you know, there will be things that I write, and we will have internal resources to handle this. We are doing a lot of legislative advocacy with our brand new, finally launched C4, the FFRF Action Fund, to try and fight this on a legislative level. What you can do at home to kind of fight this, be loud, especially if you yourself are not trans. If you are a cisgender person, one of the biggest things I can ask you to do is step up, because there are only so many of us, and this is incredibly draining work to fight for what is essentially our lives. You know, for us, this is extremely life and death type of matters. So go testify at your state legislature, go protest, you know, call your state representative. You know, do you know who your state senator is? Do you know who your state representative is? They will listen, especially at the state level. I think we're so focused on federal advocacy that we forget that state legislators love to hear from their constituents. So they will listen, and that will count. And then just generally check in on your trans loved ones. Like, check to make sure that they're okay. This is an incredibly draining time, and that is what is going to really fuel this movement and really sustain people to keep doing the work. I think that is incredibly important. And of course, if you see a state church violation of any type, not just trans-related, you can always report that to FFRF, and our incredible intake team will do our best to respond as quickly as we can. Awesome.
Thank you so much, Kat. This is a great conversation. I so appreciate Kat's time, and it concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. This week on our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters, our guests are Peter Isley, founder of Survivors Network of Those Abused by Priest, SNAP, and Sarah Pearson, director of a documentary that is examining the priest abuse problem in Wisconsin. Check out this preview.
There is something unique with the Catholic Church, and the evidence and the statistics of abuse and rates of abuse and historical transmission of abuse shows that. And this isn't just about, well, some priests are pedophiles and they just you know, or some, you know, they just happen to be priests. You know, they're pedophiles that just happen to be priests. That's not the pattern that we see. We see that the system in a way creates sexual abusers. That's the thing that is the most worrisome and terrifying for the hierarchy and the Vatican and the Pope, that gets explored. What is it about your system that is creating individuals that might come in not having that proclivity, and then over several years, they almost like cave into the system and they start abusing.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on FFRF's Facebook and YouTube channels.
And don't miss Free Thought Radio. This week, Dan and Annie Laurie are featuring a presentation by Val Benvenidez, the president and executive director for the Texas Freedom Network. You can find out how to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf.org/radio. And there's a new episode of the We Dissent podcast out this week. Liz, Rebecca, and Allison Gill talk with trans activist Sasha Buchert. You can find the program at we-dissent.org.
Yes, and if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. And if not, please join us. We will see you next week on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.